So this is not going to be a really long or super involved training. It's just sort of a basic look at the simple reports. I'll talk a little bit about how it's different from what Llewellyn showed you with the traditional reporter last week. And then if there are any questions or anything like that, we can certainly explore more. But mostly we're going to be looking at sort of those differences between this reporter and the traditional reporter. We're going to look at the different report types that are available. We're going to navigate the interface, and then we'll do a demonstration and actually put a report together. So the differences between the simple reports and the traditional reports, the big differences are that in traditional reports, you basically have three different pieces. You have the template where you select your filters and your displays. You have the reports where you actually choose what those filters will be filtering on. So, if you say that in your template that you want a filter of a date range, then in the report setup, you'll actually set up the dates for that range. And then you have your outputs. In the simple reports, they've combined the template and the report feature together. So you're actually creating your template and setting up your report all in one step. That's, I think, in a lot of ways, that's the biggest change. And that has had a couple of other changes that kind of filter down from that change. One thing that I think makes the simple reporter a lot simpler is that you don't have all of the folders and subfolders that are available in the traditional reporter. This can be a good or a bad depending on your perspective on it. But basically, there's a single folder for saving your reports and your outputs. Each of them have a single folder without the option of creating lots of subfolders. One thing that's kind of a negative about the simple reports is that they're not easily shareable. So the traditional reports, you can make them the template shareable so that somebody could come in and clone off of your template. They wouldn't be able to actually move that template into their folders, but they can clone from it and they can view your templates and things like that. That's not an option with the simple reports. However, you can still set it up so that the output can be emailed to anyone that you choose. In the traditional reporter, you have the ability to select any potential source in the database, regardless of which table it might be held in, sort of on the back end. And that's great because you can make some pretty powerful, complex reports, but it's also super overwhelming for most users. So the simple report, the biggest thing that simplifies this reporter is that it does limit the fields. Partially, those limits are somewhat changed by the report type that you're doing. And then even within that report type, you can't necessarily access every single potential field that you might want to use. And that helps you to sort of have less choice to get overwhelmed by it. One thing that I really like about the simple reports is that you have the ability to change the order that fields display in, but also change the sort order as two separate steps. Within the simple or the traditional report, the display order sort of impacts the sort order. And we'll see kind of how that can make it difficult when using the simple reporter, but it also gives you a little bit more control over what your output looks like. And then one of the big things that I think makes the simple reporter a huge boon for people is that you can save a report and edit it later. And this comes from the fact that you have just reports and outputs, not templates. In the traditional reporter, once you've created a template, you can't go back and make changes to it. All you can do is clone it and create a new template. And that's really frustrating if you're trying to make a report and there's just one little thing that you're not getting quite right, and then you end up having to make 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 templates, just trying to change this one little thing. And now you have the ability to edit it directly, which is just, I think, so much easier. So there's some good and some bad about the simple reporter. Calling it good or bad, really, I think is unfair. It's different from the traditional reporter. The traditional reporter gives you a lot of power and a lot of options. The simple reporter simplifies that. So you don't have quite as many options, but you have it's a lot easier to work with once you know kind of how it functions. In terms of that functionality, the steps to creating a simple report, a little bit easier than that traditional reporter. Basically, you'll start by choosing the report type, whether that's circulation or patron or whatever sort of broad category of report you're looking at creating. And then you go ahead and create a title, and you can save it at that point and do nothing else, and then come back to it later to add the rest. Once you've created a title, it is savable. And once it's saved, it's editable. From that point, you can choose your display fields just like you would with the traditional reporter. From there, you'll set your output and sort order kind of as a separate step rather than as part of choosing those display fields. So it kind of breaks the steps down for you a little bit. And then you'll set your filters. So basically, at first, you're choosing all of the data that you want to show up in the field in the report. And then you're saying data from specific categories. So if you want a list of patrons, your display fields will include, patron barcodes. And then your filters will allow you to say, but only patron barcodes from Clayton, or only patron barcodes for patrons whose birthday is after 2010. So you'll set your filters, and that'll allow you to kind of reduce the output that you're actually looking at to that's useful for you. Then you'll select how you want to receive that output, whether you want it as an Excel file or if you want it emailed to you or anything like that, just like you do with the traditional. And then you can save and run. And you can do that all in one step as opposed to kind of create your template, save that, run a report off of that template. You do it kind of all in one fell swoop. So we'll look at the actual process of doing this in a few minutes, but it's fairly straightforward and it does walk you through it pretty well. Where it gets a little complicated is in basically these three steps right here: choosing your display fields, making sure you have the right ones, setting your output and sort order, and that can, I think, throw people off. I think of the questions I've gotten about the simple reporter, most of them have come down to setting the output and sort order. And then obviously setting the filters and choosing the right transforms and things like that. So we'll talk about all of those when we do the demo. Before we get to that point, I do want to talk about the report types that are available. So in the traditional reporter, you can do any type of report you want. They're not necessarily limited to categories. The simple reporter gives you a few specific sort of categories to choose from, and then you can create whatever type of report works for you within that category. Those are circulation, collections, weeding, patrons, and billing and payments. So obviously you can go far beyond the examples that I have listed here, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of some of the potential reports that you can create in each of these categories. So with circulating, some of the basic ones that a lot of people would use would be circulations by date, obviously, circulations by branch, combine those and make it by branch and date, circulations by patron type, by shelving location. You can also look at things like renewals and overdues within this kind of larger circulating category. Collection reports, this is where you can get your just sort of lists of items by your library or shelving location, circulation modifier as well. You can also look at different item statuses. So, you can pull a report just of items that are currently missing. You can look at titles by libraries, so sort of go beyond specific copies, but look at call numbers and bibliographic records that your library has copies attached to. Weeding reports, this is where you can put together your shelf lists. So you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can do it by shelving location or call number. You can include that circulation date and sort of filter it down to only be things that have circulated, that they're last circulated more than 3 years ago or whatever parameter you want to use for that. And you could also get just sort of a count of circulations for each title. Patron reports, you can get your list of patrons by your library, which is pretty basic. You can also count patrons by profile group. So, if you want to see how many adult patrons versus teen patrons versus juvenile patrons you had, you could do a count of that. You could also list patrons with specific flags like juvenile or barred. And then you can also, put together a list of patrons that have upcoming expiration dates. If that's something that you wanted to kind of get a handle on before they start expiring, then you could go ahead and run that report. And then, of course, the billing and payment reports. These are a little complicated, and other than some of the most basic ones, when it comes to billing and payment reports, you might find the traditional reporters a little bit more useful, but this can be a good place to start, just to get sort of a list of bills by type or date. That could be all bills, it could be total bills paid. You could also get voided payment lists, things like that. So one of the things that kind of connects all of these examples together is that they're all fairly straightforward reports. They're not looking at very complex connections between different data types. They're all sort of pulling data from the same areas of the database. And that's one of the things that the Simple Reporter is useful for, are these very straightforward reports. These are the types of reports that are used, fairly regularly, that, help you kind of with those regular tasks in the library, like weeding or updating patron accounts. Once you start to get into really complex things like voided or holds that are lingering in transit or something like that, then that's where you want to start kind of looking more towards the traditional reporter. So once you're in the interface, it is fairly simple to navigate. It's laid out well, and it's sort of a tab navigation, so it kind of walks you through step by step. Basically, it starts out where you have two options. So unlike the traditional reporter, where you kind of have those folders along the side and you have to go into a folder, then subfolder, then subfolder to find the right template to look for, and then reports, you have to do it all over again, and they may not be in the same subfolder in the templates and the reports. This is fairly simple. You have my reports and you have my outputs, and every report you've ever created is here, and every output from every report you run is here. So, the downside of that, of course, is that if you run a lot of reports, this is going to get overwhelming pretty quickly. So you might want to make sure that you kind of keep it clean, that as you try things that don't work or that you don't end up needing again, you delete them. But for the most part, it's fairly simple in that you don't have to go digging through lots of subfolders. You know where everything is. So reports are going to be those reports that you've developed. And this is analogous to both the templates and the reports folders in the traditional reporter, because of course the templates and reports are combined together. The outputs from this list that you'll get, you'll have the link to the HTML or the CSV outputs for reports you've run, depending on what you said you want your output to be. If you want Excel, that link will be there as well. But also, if a report fails, you'll also see your error messages for it here. Those error messages aren't terribly descriptive. They don't necessarily tell you why a report failed, just that it did fail. So that's something that, if you are really struggling to get one to work and you just keep getting error message after error message, that could be a time to kind of reach out to us and say, what am I doing wrong? And we can kind of look into it and see if we can figure out what's going on, because you really don't have a huge description of what's happening here. And now within the interface, once you actually go in to create a report, then it mostly runs off of these 4 tabs. So if you can go through these in any order, but it makes the most sense, I think, to just kind of go left to right. So you have your display fields, and this is where you'll pick out those fields that you want to actually have show up as columns in your report. Your output order is where you'll determine both the sort order for the display fields that you have, as well as sort of the way that they will be arranged in the output. So if you want it alphabetical or by date descending, that type of thing. Then you'll have your filters, and this is where you can choose not only which data points to filter on, but also set those filters. So in the traditional reporter, in the template, you determine what you want to filter on, and then in the report setup, you actually set the parameters of it. In here, you'll do it all within this single tab. And then your output options is where you determine, do you want it as an Excel file? Do you want it in HTML? If you'd like to set up recurrence, or if you'd like to have it emailed to you or to somebody else, you can set all that up here in the output options. Naming and saving is kind of your final, both your first and last step, because you do need to name before you can go much further. But once you've named, you can save at any point and come back and edit. So, we recommend obviously creating fairly descriptive names and names that you will understand when you look at them. Again, because you do have sort of that one single folder for all of your reports, making sure that the names are descriptive is probably pretty useful here. And then you can save, as you're going through, and then at the end you can save and run, or you can save and then come back in and run at a later time. So that's sort of the generic overview, but we're going to go in and actually build a report now so you can kind of see all of that in action. Before we do that, are there any kind of lingering questions that you'd like to have answered before we look at the actual interface? All right. So we are in the Simple Reporter, and the way that you get to the Simple Reporter is that from the just sort of splash page under Administration, Simple Reports is your last option here. So when you get there, this is what you'll see. You'll see your Reports tab and your Outputs tab. The Reports is every report that you've created. The output is the output for all of those reports. This is what we call the angular interface, which means that you're basically going to get a list. That list, you can put filters on here. So if you want to see a report with a specific title, you can filter by that title. If you want to look at it only between certain dates, you can do that as well. You can also change the order that you're seeing them. So if you have a very long list and you want to see the oldest first or something like that, you can always change that report or that date created sort. You can also come over here to this menu and you can choose to see more rows. So in this case, I've only created 8 reports, so there's only 8 to look at there. But, if you have 25 or more or something like that, then you might want to go ahead and just change that view to see all the rows. And the same thing goes on the Outputs tab. You can filter by the report name or the finish time. You can also view more than just those basic 10 rows. So I think in this case, yeah, I've got more than 10. So I can change that to see all of them. With the output, you can basically view that output directly from here. You can either do the HTML, or if you've chosen it, the Excel or the CSV. The output options that'll be available here, you'll set that as part of your report setup. So we'll look at that when we get to that final output tab within the report. Like I said, if there is a report that fails, you'll get a little error message, but that error message is not descriptive. It just tells you there was an error, but it does not tell you what went wrong. So let's come back into the Reports tab, and let's go ahead and click on this New button up here, and we'll create a new report. So I am going to select a report type, and for this one, I'm going to do a patron report. And so for this report, I am going to choose my display fields first, and you'll notice that there are the first option here, and this will be the same for any report that you do, is common fields. So these are sort of the fields that are commonly, I believe what's happening here. So these are the fields that are commonly used in this report type. So if we open this up and if we change our report type from patron to circulation, these field options change. In addition to common fields, you can come down here to different sort of areas within the report that you could get more information on. So a common field has full name, first name, last name, lots of options for preferred name, but we could come into the name fields and we get all of that. We also get things like the prefix or suffix. We get the hold alias. So we get maybe a little bit more options within these individual kind of subcategories. For this one, I'm going to just stick with the common fields. And I need to give my report a name. So we're going to call this, let's see, we will call this expiring patrons. And I'm going to put a date on it. So that's my naming convention. You don't have to follow that by any means, but what I would recommend that you do is develop a naming convention just so that you can because you don't have those options of subfolders, just to make this a little bit more navigable, is adding in some sort of convention that allows you to kind of find what you're looking for fairly quickly, rather than sort of scrolling through all of the reports that are there to find what you need. So in terms of choosing my display fields, I am going to go with names, and I'm going to do a first name, last name rather than the full name, just because I want to be able to do a little bit of stuff with how this is sorted. I'm also going to include the preferred first name. I want the barcode so that I have that as a sort of easy thing to look up. I want the permission groups. And then because this is an expiring patron, I want the privilege expiration date and time. And then of course, I also, just to make sure that nobody's slipping through from another library, obviously the filter is where I will set that I only want Clayton patrons, but I do want to see that. I like to kind of have that opportunity to double check that my filter will work. So I'm going to choose my home library as well. And so you can see that as I added those, they showed up over here in the right side pane. Now I can change my order from here. When we go into the output order, we'll be able to change it further if we'd like, but I'm going to go ahead and change it in here. I am going to put my last name first. So these are the data points that are going to show up in my output. If you think of an Excel file, each of these will be a column, and then the individual people will be a row. So last name will be a column. I'd like that to be the first column that shows up. First name will be the next column, and then I'm going to have the preferred first name as my third column. I'll leave barcode here as my fourth. Permission group, expiration date, home library. I'm happy with all of those. So I'm going to leave this as is. I am going to keep all of my transforms as they are, with the exception of the privilege expiration date. I would like that to show up as a date rather than the raw data is going to be a timestamp. I don't really care about the hour and minute of expiration. I just want to have the date. So I'm just going to change that transform to a date. And so the transform is basically how that data is read. So if you go with the raw data, it's however it's stored in the database, whether that is, in this case, as a timestamp. In some cases, it might have very specific types of capitalization. It's often not a bad choice, but especially with dates, I feel like it's easier to go to a very specific kind of date format. You also have the option with many of them to do things like a count as your transform. So if you're doing a slightly more complicated report where you're getting a count of something, you'll change your transform from raw data to date on the just the field that you are counting. So in this case, we'd probably count the barcode because that's a unique, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. If we wanted to see everybody that was the number of people in a permission group, then we would change this to a count. And then we'd see that there are, 25 people in this permission group or whatever the case may be. But in this case, I don't want to count. I want to see a list of every individual patron. So my output order, on the left-hand side here, we see that display order that we just worked with. So if you decided that actually you want the first name first, you can go ahead and change that in this tab as well. And you can do that as much or as little as you need to. On the right-hand side is where things get a little bit more interesting, and that's your sort order. So this is how the output is actually going to be sorted. And you have basically two different levels of sorting. The first is whether or not you want it to be ascending or descending. So for first name, I'm happy with it being ascending. So ABC order, same with last name and preferred first name. For the privilege expiration date, I would like this to be sort of a descending list. So I would like the latest dates to be at the top of the list. So you can do this with any of them where you can make it ascending or descending. And that's just up to how it is that you want to read this report. Obviously, if you get it as an Excel file, you can also change that direction of sort within the Excel file once you've downloaded it too. So if you're getting this in Excel, you may not want to actually set any of this up front. In addition to the actual direction of the sort for each field, we can also choose which fields are sorted first. This is especially important if you're going to be working with a count, because the sort, you want to make sure that your count is sorted first, I believe. Otherwise, it will sort and then it will sort of count within the sort and you won't get the right numbers. But we're not doing a count right now. And that is something that if you find that you're starting to set up reports in here and you want to do counts and you'd like some further instruction on that, there is some things in the knowledge book. And then I'll also be doing sort of an open simple reports training in late spring or early summer, where we'll kind of look at some of the more complicated things like that. But for now, we're going to talk about the most basic version of this, and then if you'd like a little more instruction, feel free to reach out to me or attend that later training. I am going to change my overall order a little bit here. This isn't a count report, so it's not as important. And if I'm getting this in Excel, of course, I can change it once it's in Excel. But for now, I just want to put the permission group first because I'd like to sort of have everything come out where I get all my adults together and all my teens together. And then I would like to sort by last name before I sort by first name. And then I would also like to move that privilege expiration date up. Just so that I kind of am able to see that sorted within the output. All right, so that's our output order. If you're getting it in Excel, a lot of this can be set in the Excel file, but if you're doing a count, you'll definitely want to start by setting it up in here. So next we're going to do our filters. So we now know all of the things we want to see in the report, but we don't want to see them from every library in NC Cardinal from the very beginning. We just want to see a specific date range and a specific patrons from a specific library. So one of the nice things that you get in the simple reporter is that you get suggested filters. So these are the ones that Evergreen suggests will work well with the display fields that you've selected. One of the problems that we often come across in the traditional reporter is that people set filters that don't really work with the type of data that they have included in their displays. And then it doesn't work and they don't know why it doesn't work, and it can take a little while to kind of debug. So this helps to sort of avoid that issue. So I'm going to set a couple of different filters here. The first one, and this is one that when you're talking about patrons, you probably always want to have this added, and that's active. And you want that for most patron lists because you want to know whether or not they're active or not. And sometimes you're looking to see a list of patrons who aren't active. Sometimes you're looking for a list of patrons who are active. But either way, this filter needs to be on here. And then once you've added the filter, you can come over here and you can say whether you want them to be active or not. So in this case, I'm going to say that I want them to be active. So I'm going to select true. Another one that people often miss, but that is fairly important, is deleted. Because while best practice is to deactivate an account before it's deleted, that doesn't always happen. So we've had reports come back where people are really confused because they're getting all of these deleted accounts, but they've chosen to only include active patrons, but so they're getting basically patrons that are still showing up as active but deleted. It doesn't happen often, but it's really confusing when it does. So I'm going to add deleted as well. And in this case, I'm going to set it to false. Obviously, I want to limit by home library. I only want to see Clayton patrons. I don't want to see all patrons from every NC Cardinal library. So this is something that you're going to add in almost every report you create, is the home library filter. And I am going to keep this as raw data, and I'm going to keep this as equals. I do have the option of doing an in list. So, if you had more than one branch, you'd probably want to do the in list so you could choose each of your individual branches. In this case, though, I'm just going to choose equals, and I could do Clayton. I could also do Pocket Ellington specifically, and that is what I'm going to do. The reason that I'm going to choose that is because when you set up a patron, they are set up at the branch level, not at the system level. So the system should still pull up everyone from their descendant branches, but I'm not 100% sure that that always happens. So I always put things at the branch level unless I know that it is specifically connected to the system level in the database. So in this case, I've chosen the branch level. The next thing that I want to do, because the point of this is that I'm looking for expiring patrons, I'm going to add a filter for my privilege expiration date. And for this, I want it to be within a specific date range. I want to see who's expiring in the next 3 months. So I'm going to change my operator to between, and I'm going to change my report or my transform to date. And then I'm going to set a date of, we're going to go April 1st through June 30th. And so basically the output that I get should only include patrons who have a privilege expiration date set between April 1st and June 30th. So that between operator is really useful when you're working with dates. If I did something where it's just after and I set it for April 1st, since privilege expiration dates are set for 3 years, that's going to be a really long list and not a terribly useful list for me. Rather, it's better for me to kind of look at this distinct slice of time for a list like this. So between is really useful. And I put between as my operator for almost everything that I use with dates. And then I can set that date range to be as big or small as I'd like. But being able to set a date range, I think, is more useful for most types of reports. There are some where you specifically want to see everything from before a certain date or everything after a certain date. But most of the time, looking at sort of a slice of time, I think, is more useful. So that's pretty much setting up my filters. One of the nice things here is that I can see what I've set as my display fields right up here at the top, so I don't have to kind of come back to my display field tab if I want to check whether or not I'm displaying something. And this can be useful because you may have forgotten that you were displaying barcode, but seeing that you're doing that makes you think, oh, that might be a good filter for me. It's also helpful if you're adding a filter for something that you don't have as a display and you think, I really want to make sure that that filter is actually doing what I expect it to do. So I'm going to come back here and add an extra display field to match this filter. Once I've set up all my filters and I've set any filter values that I'd like, and I've set any transform or operator changes that I'd like, I'm going to come up here to my output options. And this is where I can choose how I'd like to see it. So I think most of the time people do want an Excel output. I do like to add an HTML output as sort of a quick check to make sure that it actually ran before sitting there and downloading an Excel report or an Excel file. But that's personal preference. So whatever works best for you. Generally speaking, the bar charts and line charts don't work real well. There's almost always just too much data for these to be super useful. You're welcome to add them if you'd like, but they're not often. I think you're going to have a better time downloading it to Excel and then making a chart within there than using one of the ones that Evergreen creates for you. But you're welcome to experiment with it. You can set up recurrence here. I will say that if you have sort of important recurring reports, you might want to set those up with the traditional reporter rather than in here. And the main reason for that is the sharing. You can have it email to anyone that you'd like, but if the person that's setting up these reports leaves or is unavailable at a time that a report needs to be changed, then having it in their account in the simple reporter, it's less accessible to other people. Whereas if you set it up in the traditional reporter and then make it shared with your library, then somebody else can come in and clone it and work off of that. So in general, if you're setting up recurrence, you might want to consider doing it through the traditional reporter, but you can set up recurrence through the simple reporter if you'd like to. So if you were going to do that, you could say you want it to recur, once a month. So every 1 month it's going to recur. I don't actually want that, so I'm going to undo it. And then you can go ahead and run your report immediately, or you can schedule it to run, for this one, since my date range starts on April 1st, I could schedule it to run on April 1st. And that way I can kind of come in that morning and immediately have that report to start working with. And then you can email it to yourself. If you're going to be scheduling it for later, I definitely recommend that you do that. It's sort of just to remind you on April 1st that report has run. If you're running it now, you don't have to email it to yourself. Obviously, you can if you like that kind of additional space for it. You can also email it to somebody else. So you're running it for yourself, but you also want to email it to Joy. You can put that in here as well. Once you have set all of this up and it's set up to run the way you'd like it to, you can save it and you can go ahead and schedule it to run. And once you've done that, you'll see this little green box. It's disappeared already, but it basically lets you know that the report ran successfully or saved successfully. If it didn't, you'd have a kind of a yellow box that said that it didn't. Under the My Outputs, one thing that I kind of dislike about the simple reporter is that you don't have a pending section. So in the traditional reporter, when you run a report, until that output is ready, you see a little option at the top that says these are your pending reports. So you kind of see, yes, this really is running. In this one, it's like I assume it's running because I hit save and run, but I have no way of actually knowing that for sure. Until it's finished running. And I can do that. One thing I do like about the simple reporter is that it has this refresh button. And that is not something that you have in the traditional reporter. You have to, change something about your output page in order to reload it in order to see whether or not it's moved from pending. But in this case, we can just hit the refresh button. It has not finished. All right. All right, so you should be seeing my simple reporter screen. This is the outputs tab, and you can see this is the report that we put together. It finished running at 11:01. So I think like maybe a minute after we switched over. So I set it to come in either HTML or Excel. So I could click on Excel and that is going to that's going to just download the Excel file. That's what the output looks like. If it had failed, we'd get this error running report message. And that is basically the output. Any questions anybody has come up with since we shifted gears, or feeling maybe not 100% great on simple reports, but ready to start learning?